After gaining independence from Belgium in 1960, the Congo should have stepped into a future of freedom and dignity. Instead, it plunged almost immediately into chaos. What followed independence was not celebration, but army mutinies, political betrayals, political bails, street violence, and a nation cracking under the weight of forces far larger than itself. At the center of this storm stood one man, Patrice Lumumba, the newly elected prime minister, and the most dangerous voice the world did not want to hear. The army rebelled. Foreign interests panicked. Old colonial powers refused to loosen their grip. Within weeks, the dream of independence began to unravel. United Nations troops arrived, not as saviors, but as silent witnesses to a power struggle that would decide the fate of an entire nation. Behind closed doors, alliances were forged, money changed hands, and plans were quietly set in motion. The Congo was no longer just a country, it was a prize. Lumumba believed independence meant more than replacing foreign flags. He believed it meant dignity, control over resources, and the right to speak the truth without fear. But truth is dangerous when it threatens power. As Colonel Mobutu rose with foreign backing, Lumumba was isolated, discredited, and ultimately arrested by forces that once claimed to serve the nation. This is not just a political story. It is a warning about what happens when a young nation dares to stand on its own. A warning about how words spoken at the wrong moment, to the wrong audience, can seal a person's fate. And most of all, it is the story of how a single speech changed history forever. If stories about hidden history, suppressed truth, and forgotten voices matter to you, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what history tried to erase. What happened next would shock the world, and it all began with one voice refusing to stay silent. To understand why that speech carried such devastating consequences, we have to step further back, beyond the chaos of independence, and into the long shadow of Congo's colonial past. The tension that exploded in 1960 did not appear overnight. It was the result of decades of suffering, silence, and carefully buried violence that the world had learned to ignore. Patrice Lumumba did not invent that history on Independence Day, he gave it a voice. At the end of the 19th century, the Congo was not governed as a nation, but claimed as the private possession of King Leopold II of Belgium. It was presented to the world as a humanitarian project, a civilizing mission meant to bring progress to Central Africa. In reality, it became one of the most extreme systems of exploitation in modern history. The land was transformed into a vast labor camp designed to extract rubber, ivory, and minerals at any human cost. Villages were emptied, families were shattered, and entire regions lived under constant fear. Violence was not an exception. It was the system itself. When reports of mass death and abuse finally reached Europe, international pressure forced Belgium to take formal control of the territory in 1908. On paper, Leopold's rule had ended. In practice, little changed for the Congolese people. The language softened, the administration became more organized, but the structure remained the same. Wealth flowed outward, power stayed foreign. Congolese labor sustained European prosperity, while the population was excluded from meaningful education, political participation, de-insmestration, or economic mobility. Generations grew up knowing only obedience, surveillance, and enforced inferiority. This was the world Patrice Lumumba was born into. He did not inherit freedom. He inherited contradiction. He was told that colonial rule brought order and opportunity, yet everything around him contradicted that promise. He watched European neighborhoods flourish while Congolese communities struggled to survive. He saw laws that claimed equality applied selectively, and institutions that preached progress deny basic dignity. Unlike many before him, Lumumba refused to accept this as normal. He read, questioned, and spoke, slowly connecting personal experience to a larger historical truth. By the time independence approached, the gap between official narratives and lived reality had become impossible to ignore. Belgium spoke of generosity, of carefully preparing the Congo for self-rule, yet the country lacked trained administrators, nearby experienced officers, or genuine political autonomy. Independence arrived quickly, not because colonialism had succeeded, but because it could no longer hold. What emerged was a fragile state carrying the full weight of its past, expected to stand upright while still bound by invisible chains. So when Lumumba listened to speeches praising colonial achievements and honoring figures associated with suffering, he was not reacting emotionally in the moment. He was responding to a lifetime of erasure. His words were shaped by a history that had never been properly acknowledged, let alone repaired. He spoke for those who had never been allowed to speak, naming injustices that polite ceremonies preferred to forget. In doing so, he disrupted a carefully maintained illusion, the idea that colonialism had been harsh but necessary, violent but beneficial. That disruption was intolerable to those who benefited from the old order. Lumumba's speech did more than criticize the past. It threatened the future plans of powerful interests that still relied on Congo's resources and instability. By publicly linking independence to suffering, resistance, and sacrifice, he reframed Congo not as a grateful former colony, but as a nation owed accountability. The reaction was swift, not because his words were false, but because they were undeniable. The consequences that followed his isolation, arrest, and eventual death cannot be separated from this deeper history. Lumumba became dangerous precisely because he connected the past to the present, and the present to a future that colonial powers could not fully control. His speech was not an outburst. It was a reckoning, and in a world built on forgetting, remembering too clearly can be the most dangerous act of all. Out of that long history of domination and denial, Patrice Lumumba did not rise as an accident of politics, but as an answer to it. The world he inherited had been carefully designed to prevent leaders like him from ever existing. Colonial rule did not merely control land and labor, it controlled imagination. It taught the Congolese people to see themselves as fragments divided by ethnicity, region, and language, never as a single nation with a shared destiny. Lumumba's greatest threat to the old order was not his anger or his defiance, but his refusal to accept those divisions as permanent. Lumumba's early life reflected the contradictions of colonial society. He was educated just enough to serve, but never enough to lead, permitted to observe the machinery of power without being allowed inside it. Yet those limits sharpened his awareness rather than containing it. Through reading, writing, and debate, he began to articulate what many felt but struggled to express. That Congo's suffering was not the result of failure or backwardness, but of a system designed to extract without giving back. He understood that political independence without economic control would be little more than a change of symbols. As nationalist movements spread across Africa in the 1950s, Lumumba recognized both an opportunity and a danger. Independence was coming, but it risked being shaped by the same logic that had governed colonial rule. Belgium had long relied on dividing the Congo along ethnic and regional lines, encouraging rivalries that made unified resistance impossible. Many emerging political groups followed those same boundaries, speaking for specific regions rather than the nation as a whole. Lumumba believed that such fragmentation would leave the Congo vulnerable, easily manipulated from the outside, and trapped in internal conflict. It was in response to this danger that Lumumba helped form the movement National Congolais, a political movement unlike anything the country had seen before. The MNC rejected ethnic politics and regional favoritism, insisting instead on a single Congolese identity. Its message was simple but radical: independence must belong to everyone, or it would belong to no one. For the first time, large numbers of Congolese people saw themselves represented not as tribes or territories, but as citizens of a future nation. This vision propelled Lumumba onto the national stage. His speeches drew crowds not because they promised quick prosperity, but because they named uncomfortable truths. He spoke about control over Congo's vast resources, not as a technical policy issue, but as a moral question. A country rich in minerals yet poor in opportunity, he argued, was not unlucky it was exploited. Without sovereignty over land, labor, and wealth, political independence would remain fragile and reversible. When Congo finally approached independence, Lumumba's rise to the position of prime minister symbolized both hope and danger. To many Congolese, he represented the possibility of a clean break from the past, a leader who understood their pain and refused to dress it in polite language. To foreign powers and entrenched interests, he represented uncertainty, a unified Congo, controlling its own resources and rejecting external dominance, threatened economic arrangements and strategic assumptions that had existed for decades. Lumumba governed for only a brief moment, but even that moment was enough to reveal the depth of the conflict he embodied. He was not simply trying to lead a new government. He was trying to redefine what leadership meant in a country emerging from deliberate underdevelopment. His insistence on unity over division, sovereignty over dependency, and dignity over submission placed him on a collision course with forces far larger than himself. In the end, Lumumba's ascent was inseparable from the reaction it provoked. His leadership exposed the fragile foundations of Congo's independence and the unwillingness of powerful actors to accept a truly autonomous African state. He did not fail because his vision was flawed. He was removed because his vision was too complete, too honest, and too dangerous to a world that preferred a divided Congo to a free one. By the time June 30th, 1960 arrived, the tension surrounding Congo's independence had been building for decades. Even if the ceremony itself was designed to suggest calm, order, and closure, the stage in Leopoldville was carefully arranged to signal continuity rather than rupture, with foreign dignitaries seated confidently and cameras ready to broadcast a smooth transfer of power to the world. Official speeches were prepared to reassure Belgium and its allies that independence would change appearances, not foundations. Hint. The past, it seemed, was meant to be thanked politely and then forgotten. Patrice Lumumba was not scheduled to disrupt that script. He was expected to listen, to smile, and to accept independence as a generous conclusion to a long colonial story. When the Belgian king praised the so-called civilizing mission and credited Congo's future to the legacy of colonial rule, the message was clear. Freedom had been delivered, not earned. For many in attendance, this framing was comfortable. It preserved dignity for the former rulers and avoided uncomfortable questions about responsibility, violence, or loss. For Lumumba, it was an erasure too heavy to ignore. When he rose to speak, the atmosphere changed instantly. There were no notes, no careful diplomatic phrasing, and no attempt to soften the truth for international audiences. Lumumba spoke from lived experience, not ceremony. He did not deny the moment's significance, but he refused to allow it to be detached from history. In clear, deliberate language, he reminded the world that Congolese independence was not the result of goodwill, but of endurance. It had been shaped by suffering, resistance, and sacrifice that could not be rewritten as a benevolent gift. His words connected the personal to the collective. He spoke of daily humiliations, of inequality enforced by law and custom, of a population treated as labor rather than citizens. This was not a speech designed to provoke outrage for its own sake. It was a declaration of ownership over Congo's story. By naming what had been hidden, Lumumba reclaimed the meaning of independence itself. Freedom, he insisted, could only be understood by acknowledging what had been overcome to achieve it. For the Congolese audience, the effect was immediate and profound. Many heard their own lives reflected in his words for the first time on a global stage. The ceremony, once distant and formal, suddenly felt personal. Lumumba had transformed independence from a symbolic event into a moral reckoning. He gave voice to those who had been excluded from official narratives and restored dignity to experiences that had long been dismissed as inconvenient details. The reaction beyond the crowd was very different. For Western leaders and observers, the speech shattered expectations. This was not the tone they had anticipated from a new African prime minister. Lumumba did not express gratitude, nor did he offer reassurance that old relationships would continue unchanged. Instead, he introduced uncertainty. By asserting that Congo's freedom was won, not granted, he challenged the moral authority of colonial powers and questioned their role in shaping the country's future. What made the speech especially unsettling was not its emotion, but its clarity. Lumumba did not threaten alignment with any foreign bloc, nor did he announce radical policies. He simply stated that Congo intended to stand as an equal, accountable to its own people rather than external interests. In the context of the Cold War and ongoing competition for influence and resources, that stance alone was enough to raise alarms. The ceremony ended, but the consequences of that moment did not. Lumumba's words traveled far beyond Leopoldville, echoing through diplomatic circles and intelligence briefings. What had been meant as a controlled transition suddenly felt unpredictable. A leader who spoke so openly about the past could not easily be guided in the future. Independence, as Lumumba defined it, demanded substance. Telisenti, not symbolism. That speech became the point of no return. It marked the moment when Lumumba ceased to be merely a national leader and became a global problem for those invested in maintaining influence over Congo. For his people, it was a declaration of truth. For powerful outsiders, it was a warning. In choosing honesty over comfort, Lumumba transformed a ceremonial occasion into a defining act, one that would reshape his fate and seal his place in history. The moment Lumumba spoke with such clarity and conviction, the meaning of Congo's independence shifted in the eyes of powerful observers. What had appeared to be a manageable transition now looked unpredictable, and unpredictability was something the global powers of the early 1960s could not tolerate. Beneath the language of diplomacy and partnership lay a deeper concern that had little to do with speeches and everything to do with control. The Congo was not only a young nation finding its voice, it was one of the most resource-rich territories on Earth, positioned at the center of a world increasingly shaped by rivalry and fear. Congo's land held immense reserves of copper, cobalt, diamonds, and uranium, materials essential to industrial growth and military power. During the Second World War, Congolese uranium had already played a decisive role in shaping global history, and that reality had not been forgotten. As the Cold War hardened into opposing camps, neutrality itself became suspicious. To Western strategists, a leader who insisted on independence from all external influence was not seen as balanced, but as unstable. Lumumba's refusal to align unquestioningly with any foreign power made him difficult to categorize, and therefore dangerous. Behind public statements of concern for stability, private discussions took a different tone. In Brussels, officials worried that decades of economic dominance could vanish overnight. In Washington, policymakers viewed Congo through the lens of containment, convinced that any loss of influence might benefit their rivals. London watched closely, calculating how a truly sovereign Congo might reshape power dynamics across Africa. None of these actors needed Lumumba to declare hostility. His insistence on Congolese control over Congolese resources was enough to unsettle long-standing assumptions. The response was subtle rather than immediate. Instead of open confrontation, pressure took quieter forms. Political opponents inside Congo suddenly found themselves better funded and better connected. Existing regional tensions were encouraged rather than resolved. The mineral-rich province of Katanga, vital to foreign economic interests, declared separation, weakening the authority of the central government and creating the appearance of internal failure. Lumumba's calls for unity now competed with narratives of disorder and crisis, carefully amplified beyond Congo's borders. As the situation deteriorated, Lumumba turned to international institutions, believing that independence came with certain guarantees, yet the support he expected never fully materialized. Diplomatic hesitation replaced decisive action, and neutrality became a convenient justification for inaction. Each delay further isolated him, reinforcing the image of a leader losing control of events rather than one confronting a coordinated effort against him. Amid this uncertainty, one figure emerged as increasingly reliable to foreign interests: Joseph Mobutu. Young, ambitious, and deeply embedded within the military, Mobutu presented himself as a stabilizing force in a moment of national confusion. Where Lumumba spoke of principles, Mobutu offered order. Where Lumumba demanded sovereignty, Mobutu promised cooperation. Support flowed quietly, transforming internal power struggles into decisive shifts. Loyalty within the armed forces changed hands, not through ideology, but through influence. Lumumba found himself surrounded by institutions that no longer answered to him. His authority eroded, not because his vision had lost support among the people, but because the machinery of power had been redirected. Each step he took to assert control was framed as recklessness. Each attempt to defend Congo's unity was presented as proof of incompetence. The narrative hardened quickly, and once it did, reversing it became nearly impossible. What made this process so effective was its invisibility. There was no single announcement, no dramatic declaration of opposition. Instead, Lumumba was slowly boxed in, deprived of allies, credibility, and leverage. By the time his removal seemed inevitable, it was portrayed as a tragic necessity rather than a calculated outcome. The world was encouraged to see his fall as the result of chaos, not design. In reality, Lumumba's greatest offense was consistency. He believed that independence meant the right to decide Congo's future without external permission. In an era when global power depended on access, alignment, and compliance, that belief marked him as a problem to be solved. His neutralization was not driven by a single fear, but by many overlapping interests that found common ground in one conclusion: a truly independent Congo, led by a man like Lumumba, was a risk they were unwilling to take. Betrayed, isolated, and stripped of every protection he believed independence would bring, Patrice Lumumba's final days unfolded far from the global stage where his voice had once carried so clearly. Power had shifted around him quietly but decisively. Allies vanished, institutions failed him, and the promises of international neutrality dissolved when they were needed most. By the time he was captured, Lumumba was no longer treated as a head of government, but as a problem to be erased. On January 17, 1961, that process reached its grim conclusion. Lumumba was executed in secrecy, far from public scrutiny, in a place chosen precisely because it offered no witnesses and no questions. The attempt did not end with his death. His body was deliberately destroyed, not out of cruelty alone, but out of fear. Those responsible understood that even in death, Lumumba could become a symbol powerful enough to inspire resistance. Erasing physical evidence was meant to erase memory itself, but memory does not obey orders. News of his fate spread slowly, wrapped in confusion and denial, yet the impact was immediate and irreversible. Across Africa and beyond, Lumumba's death was not seen as the fall of a failed leader, but as confirmation of a painful truth, that speaking honestly about freedom carried a heavy price. For many newly independent nations, his execution shattered any remaining illusions about how much independence was truly allowed. It exposed the distance between the language of democracy and the realities of power. What survived Lumumba was not a government, an office, or a title, but an idea. He became a reference point for struggles far beyond Congo's borders. His insistence that political independence without economic and psychological freedom was incomplete resonated across continents. Movements for dignity, equality, and self-determination found in his story both a warning and a source of strength. He was remembered not for how long he ruled, but for how clearly he spoke. Time has not softened the meaning of his words. Decades later, debates about sovereignty, foreign influence, service hint, and the cost of truth still echo the questions Lumumba raised. His life reminds us that history is not only shaped by victories, but by voices that refuse to compromise their principles, even when doing so would ensure survival. He proved that leadership is not measured by how safely one navigates power, but by how honestly one confronts it. They succeeded in silencing the man, but they failed to silence what he represented. Lumumba's legacy lives wherever people question inherited narratives, challenge unequal systems, and demand more than symbolic freedom. His story endures because it speaks to something universal, the courage required to tell the truth when silence would be safer. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you believe voices like Patrice Lumumba's should never be forgotten, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. By doing so, you help keep these histories alive and ensure that the ideas they tried to bury continue to be heard. Ideas they tried to bury continue to be heard. Ideas